In 1901, a British businessman who had never set foot in Iran signed a piece of paper that gave him the exclusive right to all the oil beneath 3/4 of the country. He paid £20,000 in cash and £20,000 in shares for a 60-year concession covering 480,000 square miles. In return, Iran would receive 16% of the annual profits, not 16% of the oil, not 16% of the revenue, 16% of the profits, after the company had already deducted every cost it wanted. That piece of paper created a company that would eventually become one of the largest corporations in the world. It is now called BP. And for half a century, it pumped the wealth out of Iran while paying the country less than it paid in taxes to the British government. This is the story of how one contract signed by a dying dynasty turned Iran's greatest natural resource into Britain's greatest strategic asset. The man behind the concession was William Knox D'Arcy. He was an Australian-born British millionaire who had made his fortune in a gold mine in Queensland. He lived in a mansion on Grosvenor Square in London. He was a socialite, not a geologist. He had never visited Iran and never would, but he had money, ambition, and the backing of the British government, which was eager to secure petroleum for the Royal Navy. The Shah who signed the concession was Muzaffar al-Din Shah Qajar. He was the ruler of a dynasty that was crumbling. The Qajar government was chronically broke. The treasury was empty. The Shah needed cash for a European tour he was planning and to pay off debts to Russian creditors. British diplomats and agents in Tehran helped facilitate the deal, and according to historical accounts, handsome bribes were paid to key Persian officials to smooth the negotiations. The terms of the D'Arcy Concession were breathtaking in their scope. D'Arcy received exclusive rights to search for, extract, transport, and sell oil, natural gas, asphalt, and mineral waxes across 3/4 of the entire country for 60 years. The 5 northern provinces were excluded only because they bordered Russia, and D'Arcy did not want to provoke a conflict with the Tsar. Everything else, an area larger than France, Germany, and Spain combined, belonged to one British businessman. For 7 years, D'Arcy's team drilled in the Iranian desert and found nothing. He spent £160,000 and was overdrawn at his bank. By early 1908, he was ready to abandon the project entirely. He sent a telegram to his lead geologist, George Reynolds, ordering him to cease work, dismiss the staff, dismantle the equipment, and come home. Reynolds delayed following the order, and on May 26, 1908, at a depth of 1,180 feet, he struck oil at Masjid Soleiman in southwestern Iran. It was the first major oil discovery in the Middle East. It changed the history of the world. In 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed to exploit the concession. D'Arcy became a director. Burma Oil, which had been financing the exploration, became the majority shareholder. The company began building a massive refinery at Abadan on the Persian Gulf, which would eventually become the largest oil refinery in the world. Then, in 1914, the British government made a move that transformed the company from a private enterprise into an instrument of imperial power. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, was converting the Royal Navy from coal to oil. Oil burned hotter, cleaner, and faster than coal. It gave British warships a decisive advantage in speed and range, but Britain had no oil on its own territory. It needed a guaranteed supply. The British government purchased a 51% stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. It also secured the right to appoint 2 directors with veto power over all major decisions. The company was no longer just a business. It was a strategic arm of the British state. From that point on, Iranian oil powered the British Empire. It fueled the Royal Navy through the First World War. It fueled British industry between the wars. It fueled the Allied war effort in the Second World War. The Abadan refinery processed millions of barrels. The profits were enormous. But for Iran, the arrangement was a slow motion robbery. The 16% royalty clause was calculated on net profits, which meant the company controlled the accounting. It could deduct costs, overhead, depreciation, and any other expenses before calculating what it owed Iran. The company routinely underreported profits and inflated costs. Iran had no ability to audit the books. The company refused to allow Iranian officials access to its financial records. Iran was receiving royalties based on numbers that the company itself produced, numbers that Iran had no way to verify. The living conditions at the oil installations told the story more clearly than any balance sheet. The British employees lived in a separate compound with manicured gardens, swimming pools, tennis courts, and air-conditioned homes. The Iranian workers lived in slums called Kaghazabad, which translates roughly to Paper City, because the shelters were made of flattened oil drums and scraps. There was no running water. There was no sanitation. The British and Iranian zones were separated by fences. Iranian workers were paid a fraction of what British workers earned for the same labor. It was apartheid by company policy on Iranian soil. In 1933, Reza Shah, who had overthrown the Qajar dynasty, attempted to renegotiate the concession. He canceled the D'Arcy Agreement and demanded better terms. The dispute went to the League of Nations. The British pressured hard. A new agreement was signed that reduced the concession area and introduced a minimum annual payment to Iran. But it also extended the concession for another 32 years, pushing the expiration date from 1961 all the way to 1993. And the company was allowed to choose which 100,000 square miles it wanted to keep, naturally selecting the most productive oil fields. After the Second World War, the injustice became impossible to ignore. In 1950, word reached Tehran that the American-owned Arabian American Oil Company had agreed to split profits with Saudi Arabia on a 50-50 basis. The Iranians demanded the same. The company, now called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, refused. The British Foreign Office rejected the idea outright. Sir William Fraser, the company's chairman, dismissed the Iranian Prime Minister during negotiations and flew back to London. In 1951, the Iranian parliament voted unanimously to nationalize the oil industry. The new Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, signed the nationalization into law. He argued that Iran's natural resources belonged to Iran. He argued that the concession had been granted by a corrupt, non-constitutional government under duress. He argued that the company had been systematically cheating Iran for 50 years. Britain's response was immediate and ruthless. The Royal Navy blockaded the Persian Gulf, preventing any tanker from loading Iranian oil. British technicians were withdrawn from Abadan, crippling production. Britain organized a global boycott of Iranian oil. No major oil company would buy, transport, or refine it. The Iranian economy, which depended on oil revenues for over half its foreign exchange income, began to collapse. But the blockade alone was not enough. In 1953, the British intelligence service MI6, working with the American CIA, organized a coup against Mossadegh. The operation was called Ajax by the Americans and Boot by the British. Street mobs were funded. Military officers were bribed. On August 19, 1953, Mossadegh was overthrown. He was arrested, tried, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. The Shah was restored to full power. A new oil agreement was negotiated that gave a consortium of Western oil companies, including what was now called British Petroleum, control of Iranian production. The 50-50 profit split that Iran had demanded was finally granted, but the damage was done. Iran had learned that when it tried to control its own oil, the West would crush it. The consequences of the D'Arcy Concession and the decades of exploitation that followed are not ancient history. They are the foundation of modern Iranian politics. The 1979 Islamic Revolution was driven in large part by fury at the Shah, who was seen as a Western puppet installed by the same powers that had stolen Iran's oil. The hostage crisis, the sanctions, the nuclear standoff, the isolation of Iran from the global financial system, all of it traces a direct line back to a piece of paper signed in 1901 by a Shah who needed cash and a businessman who never bothered to visit the country he was about to drain. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company did not just take oil. It took sovereignty. It took dignity. It took the profits that could have built schools, hospitals, and infrastructure in one of the oldest civilizations on Earth and sent them to London to fuel an empire and pay dividends to shareholders. The company changed its name to British Petroleum in 1954. 1 year after the coup that overthrew the man who tried to take it back. The name change was cosmetic. The wealth had already been extracted. The damage had already been done. And the bill, in the form of resentment, revolution, and 7 decades of hostility between Iran and the West, is still being paid today.